Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Thank you for spending your Wednesday afternoon with us today. I'm really happy and excited about this webinar today, Listening, Hitting the Target Using CASAS Instructional Resources. Today's webinar is really going to focus on some great resources that you can use to really improve that listening process with your students. It's really geared about preparing our students to succeed by using these effective research-based listening strategies that Ms. Veronica Pavone-Baker is going to facilitate with us today. Before we get started, I'm June Rawl, and I'm happy to be here today and partnering with Veronica. Veronica comes to us from Miami Beach Adult and Community Center in the beautiful town of Miami, and she is recording live from there right now. Veronica has such an extensive background and experience in adult education and training, so we're so happy that she was able to partner with us on this special ESOL training today. And Veronica's passion for adult education and how she's always out there encouraging others to do their very best and to reach their highest potential that they can reach. So Veronica, thank you so much. Before we get started though, I just wanted to go over a few little housekeeping tips with you. You probably know this already now since you're a veteran to this field of coming to these webinars, and we do appreciate that. But you know that you're currently muted and you're in a listen only mode. If you do have questions or comments, we would like for you to type them into the Q&A section. You'll see it right there on the screen with the arrow. And note that today's presentation, like all IP Day presentations, are recorded and they're archived for you to view and to view with your staff at any time. So with that, I'm really going to turn it over to Veronica and let her get started with this exciting webinar, Listening, Hitting the Target Using CASAS Instructional Resources. Veronica?
Thank you, Joan. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad to be here with you today. I do have to let you know that I have been under the weather, so I may sound a little bit froggy, and there might be times that I might be coughing. So my advice to everyone is to please take the flu shots. So today we're going to be focusing on some of the CASAS main items that can help teachers in the classroom by identifying the CASAS listening item types, also known as task areas. And this is an area where many teachers still are not familiar with this format in how it's presented to the students when they take a test. And it is an essential component that we need to practice with our students when we're conducting listening activities. We're also going to be identifying the correlation between the curriculum, instruction, and assessment, and as well as creating some listening strategies using the CASAS item types, and exploring what available resources do we have in CASAS.org. So hopefully we all understand that listening is a very challenging skill to teach. And I'm sure you all agree with this statement that listening is an active process of selecting and interpreting information. I can imagine the difficulty that I have sometimes when I speak the same language and making people understand me. And we understand how difficult it is for our students to try to communicate with limited vocabulary. So this frustration and anxiety that students feel when they try to communicate is what we're here for. We're trying to help them reduce this anxiety by encouraging them and motivating them so they can continue learning the second language. If you look at this statement and just take a guess, what would you say is the time we spend listening? And this is typically in a day. And how much do you think you retain? of that you hear during the day. If you want to just briefly mentally think of it, studies shown actually that we spend around 60% of our time listening, but only retain 25 of what we hear. So we understand the challenges that we have when it comes to listening. So why do we believe second language learners sometimes perform poorly in a foreign language? Listening is typically seen as a passive learning. That means we process information internally, and we sometimes we smile, we nod, and the person thinks that we are understanding. How many times does that happen in our classroom? That students are nodding their heads in agreement and within their understanding, only to find out that they do not. So this can be frustrating, not just for teachers, but for the students. And sometimes teachers assume that the students, they know how to listen. And this is a skill that may have not been learned in their first language. So we actually have to take the time to teach them how to improve their listening skills. And there are times that we tend to have listening and repeat exercises, and listening becomes just listen and repeat and not really listening comprehension. And so it is not that we have to eliminate listen and repeat activities, but it's that we have to keep the balance so we can give the students opportunity with a variety of different listening activities. So I guess we do understand that listening comprehension is an active but implicit process, which involves complex process, meaning that the student, in order to comprehend this spoken message, they have to integrate information from a range of sources, such as phonetics, lexical, semantic, and pragmatic. So listening becomes a very complex, dynamic, and fragile process. So let's see if we can try to understand a little bit about listening. Typically, there are three types of listening: informational, critical, and empathetic. Informational listening is what we do the most, is that we're listening to learn. Critical listening is when we are actually formulating an opinion, or maybe we're trying to analyze or evaluate what the speaker is saying. And empathetic listening is when we listen for that moment of emotion. And there's many different definitions for empathetic listening, but it's really understanding the other person's feelings and emotions, and that sometimes can be also very difficult. But let's look at the informational listening. Much of the listening that people engage with is informational. We listen for instructions, students listen to teachers. The CASAS assessment is primarily based on informational listening. It is based on the life and work skills, on the CASAS competencies, which are preparing the students to be able to function in a society and be able to ask questions, to understand directions. So primarily, I would say that this is a very important listening type that in our classroom we reinforce on a daily basis. So how can we improve listening or become a better listener? There are many different ways, and there are many different strategies. But here are some that are just recommendations. And there are times that we focus on the activity, but we don't give enough preparation sometimes for the listener to realize that we're going to have a moment of silence before we start this activity. This helps a student recalibrate, helps them focus. It helps them understand that this is important. There's other activities that can be done, which is identifying the mix of sounds. Even in a classroom, when you're sitting in your chair, there are sounds coming from outside. Either could be an emergency vehicle, it could be that it's raining, it could be people screaming, and so that is a good activity to say, what other sounds do you hear around you? Identifying the different sounds in that mix. And it's something that could be done in preparation of any listening activity. I used to be able to enjoy the sounds. Now I don't have any time, but the sounds that are mundane, but sounds that we take for granted. The sound of the ocean, the sound of rain. And if you go anywhere, if you now in our ever internet heaven, where we find all kinds of available resources, if you just go to YouTube and you key in ocean, you will hear different sounds of the ocean. And sometimes playing that for the students might be, again, a way of helping them relax and helping them become better listeners. But the very first thing about listening is that students need to be conscious listeners. Conscious communication is where they have this window to the world, where they can understand not just what the person is saying, but they are present. To be a good listener, you really cannot be daydreaming or drifting away. And this discipline needs to be communicated and taught to students. How do I become a present listener? I am here. I am ready to listen. Sometimes, to reinforce this, we need to help them relax, like I was mentioning before. Relax with the sounds of the ocean and the rain and so forth. And try to help them make mental pictures of what the speaker is saying. Try to avoid interruptions. One of the things that is not very conducive to listening activities is having your phone go off. So teachers could encourage the students, please turn your cell off for this activity. Not necessarily that nowadays the cell phone becomes now part of our teaching experience. So, but there are times that it is appropriate to ask our students, please turn the cell off. It is good to teach the students also to paraphrase. Play back for me what you understand. Teaching them to say phrases just like, I hear you're saying that, and then repeat back what you understood. Or I believe you're saying this. And these are phrases that they may not be used to, but we have to encourage them to play back so to see if there is understanding. And before any listening activity, it's also recommended that students understand what is the listening position I'm going to assume. Is this going to be, am I going to be an active listener? Am I going to be engaging in a conversation? Am I going to have to make a critical decision or make an opinion? So it's good always to prepare the students what position they're going to have. You're going to be an active listener, you're going to be a passive listener, you're going to be an empathetic listener, and this helps the process and the focus of what to capture what they're saying. And there's another very simple strategy that is highly recommended. It's called RASA, R-A-S-A. And it's to remind the students that when they are listening, there are 4 simple steps that we ask them to do. First, we want you to pay attention. This is the receive. You're going to receive information. Now starts appreciating. Start understanding. what is being said. And then that paraphrase, summarize. Can I summarize what I just heard? And this process has to be repeated over and over until the student takes it as a given behavior. That means I am doing a listening activity and I am doing the receive, I'm going to understand, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to ask for questions if I need clarification. So this strategy, RASA, is very helpful before, again, practicing with students listening activities. I suggest maybe posting the poster around your classroom as a reminder that this is the steps that we're going to use. This is the technique that we are going to follow. And it may take a few tries until they become used to, this is the behavior. This is the technique I'm going to use to improve my listening skills. Now, we also need to understand about two types of listening process. Our students, some of them we call bottom-up listeners or top-down listeners. The bottom-up processing is when listeners really are using their knowledge of the words, the syntax, and they're focusing on the grammar to analyze or comprehend the information they're listening. So usually these students spend a great deal of time in trying to focus on the syllables, or this is where they're trying to translate word by word. And they, again, because they're conscious and they want to improve, they are taking a great deal of time, and so they are limited in comprehending. That means they only are able to comprehend small chunks of information. And usually our first levels of ESOL, they might be bottom-up listening process. They're trying to get the information, and it's really sometimes, I remember students even telling me, I have a headache. I have a headache because they're thinking so hard. The top-down listening is what we want to move our students to advance to. So the top-down processing is when listeners use their knowledge of the world. This is as commonly known prior knowledge. And also now we call it funds of knowledge. Our adult students come with experiences. They have real situations that they can relate to. And all this helps to relate to the human interaction and to interpret or predict the information. So top-down listeners, they are listening for the gist of the conversation, and they have the capacity of a higher level of operation. That means that they can handle a bigger chunks of information. So we want to move our students from bottom up to top down. So some of the activities or strategies that we can use for our lower level ESOL students when they're in the bottom up process is to help them learn to predict, to start guessing words from context. Scanning and skimming. This is not just a reading strategy. They can do the same technique when they're listening. Can you do the scan and skimming in a listening version? Yes, they can. And so we have to walk them through that. Sometimes reading a sentence and asking the students to write 2 words of what they were able to understand. Not necessarily every word, because we want to move them to understanding the conversation in the gist of it, not word by word. Some of the strategies that we can use for top-down instructional strategies for the listener in the top-down tier is sentence strips. And sentence strips has been used in reading comprehension for many years, but it can also be used verbally. And that means that you can give 2 or 3 sentences and verbally, and they have to put it in sequence. Sometimes they can work with a partner that will have the script of the sentences, and the other person then will put the sentence strips verbally in sequence. Listening to a conversation and deciding where is this conversation taking place. Are the speakers in a hospital? Are they in a restaurant? And so it's not necessarily word by word again, is understand what's happening in the overall message. Then the other one is reading a passage and asking students to make inferences verbally about the relationship of the people involved in the passage. There are many others, but this is just some of the strategies that could be very helpful to prepare our students to increase their listening skills. Now, this is a very, before we go into the CASAS resources, just one word. This is a fun activity that weather forecast you have to work with them. Well, what's the weather yesterday? What do you think is going to be tomorrow? And introduce some of the vocabulary, and then play the weather forecast, a short one, no more than 3 minutes, 2 minutes to 3 minutes. And I do have a reference in the PowerPoint later on that you can use. And then ask questions. How much rain is it predicted? How much rain is it expected on Thursday? So always remember, whatever activity that you're going to discuss, you're going to review the keywords, and then they're going to listen for meaning. Now, why are we here today? I think that listening for us has been always a challenge for our students. And so listening is more important now than ever for certain reasons. But the listening test that we're using now is a 980 series, and it's slightly longer, and it has more content coverage of the CASAS competencies. It is based on the CASAS competencies, and that has not changed. And also, the great part of this is that in Florida, we are placing students based on the lower of the 2 modalities. And I'm just going to share one of my undocumented studies, I call it. But last term, I tried to track the students, new students that were coming in, and see which modality was lower. And 60% of those new students, it was listening. What that means to me is that those students that the initial functioning level is listening means that their progress will be measured on that listening modality. And so it is important to spend some time in identifying this component that our students need to know, which is the more I know about what I'm going to be presented with, the better it would be. So we want to use the resources available to us. We have CASAS.org has an abundance resources available. And I highly recommend that all teachers register for CASAS. And in CASAS.org, there's an excellent tool that is called Quick Search. And the Quick Search is the best friend of teachers because you can key in topics. You can key in a competency, and it's going to give you references of books that you can use, videos, and even listening activities. So if you are teaching, I almost would say that it's almost a must to be part of the CASAS.org resources and discover everything that is there for you. If you're using eTests, it is available through eTests for students to be scheduled for a practice sample test item session. You will need to work this out with your testing department, but it is available, and it's also available in reading and listening. But it is wonderful to prepare our students to help them reduce that anxiety and frustration. So if there is a way that you can arrange for a CASAS listening practice session, it will be highly productive for your class. We also have all the CASAS sample test items, and this helps the students get familiarized with the test formats as well as practicing. And this is all available through either PowerPoint presentation, or also if you're using eTests online, they also have sample tests for you to use. I like to share it with students. So I like to show the students, here is a resource available for you, because it is open for everyone. So if you can guide them where they can locate the sample tests, then they can practice on their own. And they will come to your class prepared, which is a wonderful thing. So let's take a closer look at the 980 listening test series score ranges. As you can see, the 980 listening series and the 80 reading series are different. They're close, but they're not. Every teacher should be familiar with these ranges. And every time a student comes to the classroom, wouldn't it be wonderful to know how they did on that test? And there are ways of communicating with your testing department, or I'm sure you have a process of getting this information. But it is essential to know, how did my student do? What happened in that listening test? What happened in that reading series? And you would see that many times, of course, they're in different levels. So remember, they're placed on the lower of the two. So it could be that my listening is in low beginning, and my reading could be in high beginning. And this is why we understand that we all have multi-level classes. But this score ranges chart, it is not a secret. It can be shared with students. So by all means, have it posted if you feel that will be helpful for your class. The other chart that we need to also understand is the test series. And CASAS has 3 levels, A, B, and C. And for listening, we have 2 test forms for each level. Students do not take these test forms sequentially. That does not mean that students take a 981 and I'm going to take a 982 next. No, this could be interchangeable. So sometimes the students will go from level A to level B. But the more that you share information with the students, the more prepared they are. The test is a time test, and this is as well important information our students need to be aware of. On average, listening tests are around 50 minutes. But as you can see, the number of test items are the same, 38 questions in all the levels. 38 test item questions. You can call them questions, there's no problem. There's 38 questions. So if I would ask, can you guess how many we have in listening task item types? We have task areas in reading, and we have in listening. So could you, in the chat, write briefly if you know how many test item types or task areas do we have in listening? 10%. Okay. Good. So we have some suggestions, 4 and 5 and 6. And this is going, if you're teaching ESOL, this is going to be part of your bank of knowledge. It's something that we must know. So actually, we have, one moment. We have 4. So the test item types are simply the format in which a question is presented to the student on the test. And we all work so diligently to practice listening. But the truth is that many times the activities that we're doing when we practice listening is not the format which is going to be presented to that student. So that can be a little bit confusing for them. So the stronger that we as teachers get in understanding this, we can take any listening activity and then turn it into the CASAS test item types. Does not matter what book you use, as long as I teach from this concept. So picture prompt, comprehension question, predict next line of dialogue, identify true statement based on the prompt, which is simply which is correct. And we're going to take a closer look in a moment to each one of them. But before we do, let's look at one more chart. And this is again the levels A, B, and C. And you can see that the item types are not necessarily in all of the tests. If you look at photo prompt, in level A, you have 10 items or questions that will have a visual. That's not the case for level B and level C. So if I have a class that is in level B or level C, and I'm practicing listening activities, would it be beneficial for me to let the student look at pictures to figure out the answer when I do a listening activity? So sometimes we're going to have to say, close the books. We're going to do it differently. When you look at the comprehension questions are in all of the levels A, B, and C. However, we have a few more in level A. And then next line of dialogue, you have all levels, but a few more in level B. And notice on the last and most difficult test item type, which is correct, and we're going to know why that is more difficult than the other ones, is none in level A. So I should focus on level B and C, which is correct, that item type for the higher levels. So I like to think that we are working smarter, that we take the time to actually prepare our students with the appropriate information and the appropriate techniques. And let's look at level A, and let's look in detail what happens in that level A test item types. First, let's understand what is a picture prompt. A picture prompt is when the student is listening to a statement, but they are looking at the screen and they have a visual interpretation. And they do have 3 pictures, and they have to select the correct visual based on what they are listening to. But remember, they have 10 questions that they will have a visual. Then they have 15 comprehension questions, and comprehension question is usually the most common one. But the students do rather well because there is a question. The first thing they hear is a question. Then they're going to listen to a statement or to the dialogue, and then the question is repeated, and then the options. So usually it's better because if I know what I'm listening for, I'm more attentive. So comprehension question is a question, a statement or dialogue, question again, and then your 3 options. Predict next line of dialogue is the most challenging one because the students start listening to a conversation, to a dialogue or a statement. There's no preview question. So they start listening, and then comes a question. What should come next? Which is usually what's the most appropriate statement to finish this conversation or dialogue. And then they have 3 options. So these are the 3 main test item types in level A. Just as information, the students are presented with practice items before each segment. So this is an excellent way to let them know, be careful, because you will see the word practice on the screen. And that is not part of your exam or your test. So when you look at practice, these are the questions that are going to be presented to you in the next few questions. So listen or pay attention to how it's framed so they can be ready. Now, level B has no picture prompt. And let me just say that in level A, everything is repeated, so everybody's happy because I hear it twice. Then it gets a little bit harder when I go to a level B test form. Why? Because I have no pictures, and I have in how many words, items? 12 items. There will be no repetition, which is the identified true statement. The identified true statement is similar to predict next line. It has no preview question. It starts with a conversation, but they will always ask which is correct. And then they give 3 statements, 3 options for the student to select. These are essential for our students to understand what the question will be presented. Level C, notice there's no more repetition. And here is where our students become the top-down listening process. Now they really need to understand what is being said. So just to recap briefly, picture prompt has visuals, comprehension question has a question, a dialogue or a statement, a question, and then the options. Predict next line starts with a conversation, no preview question. The question comes at the end, what should come next, or what is the most appropriate statement, and then the options. This identified true statement, again, no preview question, and they have to listen, and then which is correct. Sometimes they used to call this true statement, because it actually is not true or false. This is which statement is correct based on what I heard. The more that we understand this format, the better it will be for us to teach our students how they need to prepare, how they need to be a present listener, a conscious listener. And all this information is not just for teachers, these are for students. So let me take a closer look just to make sure that we understand the test item types. If you look at this script, and remember, students do not get a script, they get pure listening. But let's assume that they are listening and somebody says the direction is, who is lost? And they hear a conversation. My daughter is lost. What does she look like? She has curly brown hair and blue eyes. What's her name? Her name is Sarah. She's 7 years old. There she is. The question again, who is lost? A, his mother. B, his daughter. C, his sister. So based on just looking at that script, which one would you say this is? Would this be a picture prompt? No. Would this be a predict next line of dialogue? No. Remember, predict next line of dialogue does not have a preview question. So this is a comprehension question. So let's take a look at another one. Listen to the conversation, then choose the correct answer. Again, no scripts, pure listening. Good morning, can I help you? Yes, my son is a new student. What is his name? It's Tony Lim. Okay, what is your address? It's 1333 Four Way. What grade is he in? Now comes the question. Choose the best response. A, my son Tony Ford is in 4th grade. B, my son's grades are very good. C, my son Tony Lim is in 4th grade. I would tell you that this, again, could be very difficult because it's confusing, and sometimes that's what happened. You hear 4 way, and it is in part of that options, but the correct answer is my son Tony Lim, C. And this is what type of item type? Predict next line of conversation. Very good if you answer that. One more. Where are these people? So even without reading, if we look, there's a question, there's a statement or an announcement, a question, and options. So right away, I know I hear you all saying, this is a comprehension question. Excellent. And this is again, the best response. Choose the best response. May I speak to Luis? Predict next line. And the very last one is the one that also is the most difficult. Good morning. There is a conversation. And then it's asking which is correct. That's what the students are going to hear, which is correct. A, B, or C. No preview questions. So these test items have to be part of your everyday teaching. If you remember, this is what students see. This is all they see. They don't see anything else. They don't have an opportunity to ask questions for clarification. So listening becomes what we call pure listening. And they definitely need to be present, and they have to be conscious listeners. I just want to share one thing with you about the CASAS reports. CASAS gives several reports, but this report is an excellent report that can be part of your classroom instruction, the next assigned test. This is where teachers know what test form are you going to have next time. And so I can prepare them in a faster way. This is also an excellent report where you can see the students that are in level A and B. And this report comes for listening and reading. Once you have this report, it is something that we have been trying for a couple of years, and my learning plan. And this is based on the test forms, the listening test forms. If you notice, and this is also available for you at the end of the presentation. So if my student is in level A, and this student is going to have the next test 981, I want to give my student an opportunity to take ownership of their learning. So I can give them this learning plan and say, these are competencies that we're going to cover in this classroom during this term, but I also want you to work when you have an opportunity on these areas that might be very helpful for you. It can also be used with another report that is the individual student performance, and you can also individualize it. That means that you can identify the competencies that the student did not master on the first test. And the best way to use this is allowing the students to use their books, because you're going to show them all these competencies are listed in the scope and sequence, and they're correlated to units. So I need you to find a couple of them and identify which unit that competency is in and what day did you review it. And if you happen not to find those competencies in the books that we're using, you want to tell the student, I want you to tell me, because we're going to make sure that we cover that competency in our classroom. Notice also the column that says frequency, and this is the competency. It's a marvelous way of identifying priorities, because if I know that 014 is going to be in 3 different items or 3 different questions, I want to practice that. I want my students to be very strong in making sure that they understand how this relates to the exam. When I started working with students years ago, I always heard the same comment. What did that test had to do with what we learned in the classroom? So I made a commitment to myself that that was not going to happen to my students, that they were going to know that they had all the preparation, all the practice that I could provide to them. So none of them will come out of that testing session saying, what did that test had to do with anything? This has to do with everything. It has to do with learning. That is our goal. Our goal is for them to be able to speak the language, to be able to transition to post-secondary education, to be able to find a better job. And we should never lose track of that. This is important enough that we have to get a little bit more focus in using our CASAS resources in order to help our students prepare. I know I've been talking for a while, and I do apologize. If there are, if you give me a minute, let me see if I can answer some of your questions. What are good available resources online to use for teaching the life and work skills for reading and writing? There are many, and Seminole has excellent resources online to practice also for reading. We're focusing on listening, but it's the same concept. The next question is, this is something that must request for our test administrator. In regards to the reports, you need to talk with your administration. Reports are generated through either the testing department or someone assigned. Many of the reports, they can be emailed. You don't have to be printing reports. So our teachers receive information through email. And this is the basis for really creating a good lesson plan. Understanding that reports gives me the data, the information that I need to focus to help my students. And yes, you will all have a PowerPoint, and we also are providing a workbook, a workbook that it will be available that has the several suggestions in listening activities. And we have the PowerPoint, we have the learning plans for all the test forms available, and we also have the handbook for you. So I do hope that you have found this beneficial, and that you register with CASAS.org, and we are all in this together, and I will be glad to answer any questions via email later on. But once again, it has been a pleasure to spend this hour. It went actually very quickly, but I do believe that June has a few words that she needs to say.
Thank you so much, Veronica. That was really helpful. Thank you so much. Well, let me just recap a few things. First off, I want to let you know that the PowerPoint and the workbook and the learning plan that Ms. Baker referred to is on the will be on the IPDAY website. So everything is archived and it's on there. You just go to ESOL and you go to the webinar tab button, and that's where you can find it. So any other questions too that you have about e-testing? I saw that there were some questions coming through about training for CASAS. Contact Phil Anderson at the Department of Education, because there are some trainings that are we're going to be going around the state, and we're going to be concentrating on that CASAS software and all the reports and everything that go along with that. So Veronica, if we could just go to the next slide. I just want to remind everyone that there's lots of stuff happening still out there with Florida IPDAY. We have a lot of face-to-face workshops that are still going on, particularly in GED, social studies, and science. We have some great reading workshops. We have some math workshops that are going to be coming out in the spring. We have some professional development opportunities that are just really serving those teachers and staff that work in correctional facilities. And there's a lot of new lesson plans and resources that are being developed by Florida subject matter experts. So you have to continuously go to the IPDAY website and look for all the new things. And if you can't find something that you're looking for in particular, just give me a ring. We're always here to help you. But before you go, I just wanted to take a few more minutes of your time, really less than a minute, and just get some feedback from you. Your voice is really important to us, so we really would like to get some feedback. On your screen, you will see 3 short survey questions that will now appear. If you could just take a moment to answer those questions and give us your responses, we would really appreciate to have that feedback from you. We'll give you about a minute, and then the poll will close, and then I'll just wrap up with my closing comments. Okay, the poll is now closed, and I really want to thank you so much for your feedback. We'll definitely look at those that feedback, and it's something that we really treasure hearing from you. I want to bring to your attention that our next webinar, which we've heard a lot out in the field, is how do you mine that GED Ready Score report. So we've partnered with Daphne Atkinson from GED Testing Service and Bonnie Gooden, and they will present a great webinar on February 21st on mining a GED Ready Score report. So with that, I wish you a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you on February 21st on our next webinar or at a next face-to-face conference. Again, thank you for your support and joining us today. Have a great day.
Have a good one.